In this summary of the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, Jordan Peterson discusses with his guest, Helen Joyce, a journalist and advocate of biological women's rights, issues of censorship, freedom of association, gender segregation in private spaces, and the impact of marketization on social relationships. They begin by expressing frustration over the risk of censorship on various platforms, including YouTube, potentially limiting their ability to openly discuss controversial topics. They note the irony in that platforms such as YouTube had initially been seen as open and public forums for free speech, but are increasingly acting as gatekeepers curating content. As they move into the main discussion, Peterson and Joyce address the contentious subject of gender-segregated spaces. They discuss the implications of allowing men into traditionally female private spaces, such as bathrooms and changing rooms. Joyce argues that it's not about prejudice against men, but rather it's about safety, privacy, and dignity for women. The conversation transitions to the topic of freedom of association, the right to associate with whomever one chooses, as long as it doesn't harm others. They contemplate whether this freedom applies in all contexts or has limitations, specifically regarding same-sex gatherings or spaces. Peterson brings up the complex issue of gender competition in sports, which stirs debate over fairness. Joyce suggests categorizing sports into female-only and open categories, allowing female athletes who can compete at the lower levels of men's divisions to do so without it being a problem for anyone. Peterson also addresses the challenging matter of blatant prejudice in the context of freedom of association, alluding to hypothetical situations like a men-only corporation or racially discriminatory practices. He posits that the market might naturally correct such behaviors by revealing them as self-defeating. Joyce contributes to this discussion by introducing the idea of marketization of social relationships, how commercial interests are expanding into non-economic realms such as family, care for the elderly, and even dating through apps. According to Joyce, this extension of market logic into personal spaces brings with it regulation, surveillance, and opinion from the government and the public. Also, they discuss the controversial issue of sex work and its implications for personal freedom. Joyce raises concerns over the marketization of intimacy, leading to concerning trends in academia, suggesting that sex should be commodified and devalued to a mere economic transaction. Notably, Joyce highlights the critical issue of women's bodily autonomy and consent regarding medical procedures. She expresses dismay at the fact that women's rights to choose who can perform invasive procedures on their bodies are being reassessed or overlooked. Towards the end, Peterson and Joyce express admiration for J.K. Rowling's stance and resilience against intense criticism and online harassment due to her views on gender issues, underscoring the potential personal cost of engaging in controversial discussions. In this rollicking middle section of the podcast, Peterson and Joyce address issues related to free speech, gender politics, and workplace dynamics. They delve into their own experiences with attempted censorship and threats to their professional status, highlighting the impact public opinion and corporate policy can have on individual rights and freedoms. Peterson begins by revealing attempts by the Canadian colleges of physicians and psychologists to regulate and discipline him for discussing contentious topics. Predictably, Peterson stands defiant, countering the potential threat of a disciplinary board with the promise to publicize any such actions on his YouTube channel. This open challenge to institutions seeking to curtail his speech sets the tone for the rest of the conversation. Joyce, who has become a controversial figure for her unyielding advocacy for biological women's rights, describes her experience publishing a book on the subject. She explains that while some find themselves embroiled in a nightmare after being canceled, she's actually enjoying herself. She attributes this largely to the support she's received from her former employer, The Economist, as well as the camaraderie she's found among colleagues who share her views at Sex Matters, an organization advocating for recognition of the binary nature of sex in law and life. Joyce describes the difficult situations some people face when their loved ones transition genders. Wives of transitioning men, for example, struggle when their husbands forcibly redefine their sexual orientation, with society often condemning any resistance to this change as bigotry. Both Peterson and Joyce acknowledge the pain endured by those silenced due to the very real social pressures that accompany such changes. Peterson and Joyce also discuss the importance of resilience in the face of adversity. Peterson praises Joyce's boldness in standing against the prevailing societal norms, while Joyce attributes her success to her editor at The Economist, who refused to capitulate to demands that Joyce be silenced. They consider the struggles of fellow commentators like Barry Weiss, who left the New York Times due to its intolerant workplace culture, is rather absurdly classified as right-wing. They also discussed their concern about the increasing homogeneity of journalism, particularly as the industry becomes a graduate profession, distancing it from diverse representativeness of the public opinions. In the final part of the podcast, Peterson shares his admiration for Joyce's audacity and principles. He likens her to one of the righteous few who would have stopped the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah from meeting their fate, as per the biblical narrative, complimenting Joyce on standing firmly for her beliefs, regardless of the societal pressure to conform. Joyce's book, titled Trans: When Ideology Meets Reality, is also brought up in the conversation. Peterson acknowledges the potentially contentious nature of the book, jestingly warning his audience that reading it might make them reprehensible. He satirically adds that the book might end up with their phones being confiscated by the Irish authorities if they were to visit Ireland, reflecting the level of controversy Joyce's views can engender. Despite these joking remarks, it's clear that Peterson not only admires Joyce's courage, but also strongly aligns with her viewpoints. He respects Joyce for recognizing a distinction between ideology and reality, and for expressing this sentiment consistently, both verbally and through her written work. Peterson also encourages his audience to visit Joyce's website, thehelenjoyce.com. He lightheartedly adds that there might be some poor woman out there upset that she didn't get to claim the domain first. Peterson suggests his audience might also find it worthwhile to follow Joyce on Twitter. The podcast ends with a cheerful thank you from Joyce to Elon Musk, the renowned tech entrepreneur. Though the context for this shout-out isn't provided in this portion of the transcript, it might be interpreted as a nod to Musk's support of free speech, aligning with the podcast's core theme. With concluding pleasantries exchanged, Peterson ends the recording with a thankful tone, and they move off to record for the Daily Wire. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.